Hello everyone and welcome to University of Glasgow's new Advanced Research Centre known as the ARC. So we are delighted to be hosting Glasgow Doors Open Day Festival Hub for the first time, and we're also delighted that this overlaps with our own festival known as Arcadia, and that's taking place from the 16th to the 30th of September, and that will celebrate the opening of our brand new building and all the research that happens in here. All the Arcadia events are free, and you can find programs in the details in the programs that we've left for you. So this weekend we have lots of events happening in the Arc. There are tours. There's an outdoor ceilidh on Saturday. Please come along. You'll be very welcome. If you're interested in the design of our new building and what goes on inside, please join our talk with the architect and researchers at 3 o'clock on Saturday. And there are full details on our website at gla.ac.uk/Arcadia. So I'm going to now hand you over to Stephen, and he will share more about the Doors Open Day events and introduce tonight's talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, how are you all? Great to see you. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name's Stephen Sheriff. I'm the Events and Development Coordinator for Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. GBPT is essentially a charitable property developer, and we rescue, repair and return to their communities buildings at risk across the city. And since 1990, we have been delivering Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival, and we've been doing that in partnership with the Scottish Civic Trust, the national coordinator. Doors Open Days now happens in every region in Scotland, so I encourage you to go onto the national website and find out other places that you can visit across the country. We are very grateful to the university for hosting us this year in this new amazing building. Special thanks must go to Cassie Dillon, to Zara Gladman and to Kenneth Skeldon, who've been working alongside us to realise this event. More thanks must go to the tech team who've been making everything in this room work, and to Ev Buckley, who's with us tonight, making sure all goes well. During the digital festival in 2020, we all scrambled to figure out how all the Zoom worked, and we found that we actually had this amazing audience, and these lectures were archived onto our YouTube channel. And now, speakers aren't as keen as delivering things on Zoom, but we still do have that audience. And so this event is being live streamed. And if anyone, wanted to come along tonight, but they couldn't make it, or if you want to watch it again, then you can log on to our YouTube channel and or Facebook or Twitter, and it will all be there for you. I'd like to say thanks to our supporters, Glasgow City Council, the Arlington Baths, Parade Park, Garden and Theobald, and all of the supporters that make this event possible. Like many cultural events, Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival is suffering and still struggling to recover from the pandemic. So if you would like to make some sort of donation, there is a box at the front and we can take donations on card. If you want to get a snazzy t-shirt, you can do that too. And those are available on your way out, exits of the gift shop. Just a couple of health and safety things to go over. We're not expecting a fire drill tonight, but in the unlikely event of an alarm, please go through the doors behind you, across the exhibition floor, and through the doors, and the assembly point is in the courtyard at the rear. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, I have some thanks today to say, some more thanks. Having Jack come to Glasgow to speak really was a pipe dream until I met Dr. Jane Goldman, who's with us tonight, who I think was as excited as I was about the prospect of the visit. And Jane introduced me to Vasiliki Kolokotroni, the chair of the Glasgow Gifford Lectures. And so they have generously supported this event, and I'd like to say a really huge thank you to you for making it possible. So, do you like the world around you? Are you ready to behave? You may recognize this line from another of my heroes, Patti Smith. And I think the answer to this question for many of us, certainly for myself, is no. But in a world where the rich are getting richer, the powerful act with impunity, I think it's easy to feel disillusioned that the obstacles to addressing the great disparities in our society are insurmountable. I was late to the party, and I only found the work of Jack Halberstam during lockdown, which I spent some of at my parents' house in the beautiful countryside of East Kilbride, seeking comfort during a time which doubled or tripled feelings of uncertainty and helplessness. I think this feeling of helplessness can in part be attributed to the tools of change that we're afforded by our society, created as they are to keep us contained, and living as we do in a time where even the most basic of these tools, such as freedom of speech and the right to protest, are being attacked and eroded. So imagine my delight when watching a Jack Halberstam lecture on YouTube on a running machine in my parents' study. I'm afforded a new lens with which to view the world and a whole new toolbox. The possibility of a world not refreshed, but wholly new flooded my mind. I felt engaged, I felt invigorated, I felt ready to create, I felt ready to act. And then I went next door and ate a stir fry that my mum had made me. But I remember the possibility of that moment. So you may wonder what the link between a building preservation trust and the work of Jack Halberstam is on dereliction, abandonment, unbuilding and unmaking. Well, I suggest that both are concerned with using that which has been abandoned as a foundation for the creation of better places for people to live, to work, and to flourish. Professor of Gender Studies at English at Columbia University, Halberstam is author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity in a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans Asterix, a quick and quirky account of gender variance. Halberstam's latest book is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Places Journal awarded Halberstam its Arcus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Halberstam is now finishing a 2nd volume on wildness titled Unworlding and its aesthetics of collapse. Halberstam was recently the subject of a short film titled So We Moved by Adam Pendleton, which played at MoMA through January 30th, 2022. Jack Halberstam, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephen, and the Open Days Festival here in Glasgow and the university for getting me here. I'm really excited, in fact, to talk to you today about the topic of unbuilding, which, as my research has shown, runs right through Glasgow and the cycles of building and demolition, dereliction and abandonment that characterize architecture and social projects in this city. Now, you know, Glasgow really isn't the topic of my research, but when I got this invitation, I thought, well, let me take some of the material that I've been developing on New York City and see how some of it might play out in a different location in relationship to different populations under different pressures. And before I get your expectations too high, the talk isn't really about Glasgow, but I will keep referring to Glasgow and to particular landmarks in the queer literature and art of Glasgow that in a way support some of the arguments that I want to make. The main thing that I'm going to say to you today is that rather than just being concerned repeatedly with whether we should be building more or whether we should be tearing down, we should slow down a little bit and think about some of the artwork that comes out of demolition itself. So that's the argument, which is why the talk is called, I think you have something there that, sorry, probably we should have played it, but we'll go back, okay. This is why the talk is called Collapse, Demolition, and Queer Landscapes. precisely because I'm going to make the argument, and you can refute it and argue with me later on, that there is such a thing as an aesthetics of collapse, and that all of the aesthetics is not just in the building. It's also in how something comes down and what happens when something comes down. And there's a whole gender politics in emphasizing building over collapse too, which will become very clear, I think, particularly in relationship to the reading that I'll do of Douglas Stuart's novel, Shuggie Bain. And then demolition. It turns out, while demolition just seems like the aftermath, the detritus, the rubbish after a building has collapsed, in fact, many artists, many of them queer artists of color, have found demolition sites to be the archive for the very projects that they want to make. So now we begin to see that collapse has an aesthetic, that demolition provides a kind of archival site with which creative, inventive, marginalized people imagine something else. And then from there, we'll think about how the whole landscape itself can be rethought of as queer. And that's a difficult idea because so much of queer art, if you go to any kind of queer exhibit, and I've had to write catalog essays for multiple queer art exhibits, I can tell you definitively that some 98% of what people call queer art is naked male bodies painted by gay men. And that's like literally the bulk of the understanding of queer art. And what that leaves out is entire movements like abstraction, for example, which abstraction, there are many, many queer artists who have painted under that heading. But it also leaves out lots of female painters who, on the one hand, might have been interested in domestic interiors, and there's a whole group of them. And on the other hand, people who paint landscapes. And there are artists in Scotland who have done just that and who have therefore had a hard time finding their place under the heading of queer art. So once we shatter some of the familiar frameworks for thinking about architecture, art, social planning, and queerness, whole new areas of thought open up. That's the plan, that's the idea. And now I'll try to give you examples of how this works. Some of the artists who I'm going to explain as I go literally use demolition and collapse as their vocabulary, include people who are not avowedly queer but produce what I consider to be queer art. So the one person you may have heard of is Gordon Matta-Clark. How many people have actually heard of Gordon Matta-Clark? Not as many as I would think. Okay, so Gordon Matta-Clark was part of a Chilean immigrant family living in New York City in the 60s and 70s. And at that time, New York was bankrupt and whole parts of the city were literally falling down. And in this falling down city, Gordon Matta-Clark grew up and decided to go off to school to study architecture. So off he goes to Cornell, studies with Peter Eisenman, comes back to New York City, sees that the whole city is falling down, and he decides that with his architectural training, he will become what he calls an anarchitect. An anarchitect. And it's a beautiful word because it joins anarchy with architecture. And then unravels the conventional meaning of architect, which is to sort of master the environment. And what Matta-Clark does is he begins to unbuild buildings across the landscape of New York. And we'll look at some of that in a moment. But the person, the queer person who took images of Gordon Matta-Clark's work was a black gay photographer called Alvin Baltrop. And he took beautiful photographs in the 1970s of the West Side piers as they were falling down. And in those photographs, we find images of Gordon Matta-Clark's buildings within those piers. So there's a nice confluence there. What I would say about them to sort of start this, unraveling this theory of an aesthetics of collapse is that they make art using the vocabulary of demolition and collapse. right? So what if you were an architect who was committed to taking things down rather than building things up? That's the an-architect. What if you were taking pictures of putatively men cruising in the piers, but what actually takes up the bulk of the photograph are the falling down buildings? That means that you're making art out of this scene of collapse. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to see what are the features of such an aesthetic. What does such an art look like? What does it do? Why would people want to unbuild things? Why would someone be drawn to the pictures of collapse, and so on? Now, it turns out that the spectacle of collapse is central to something that we call ruin porn, okay? And I'm sure that would come up in the Q&A anyway. How is what you're talking about not just ruin porn? Well, it is ruin porn in a way. And the first thing I want to do is say I don't completely distance myself from an investigation into ruin porn. But what I want to draw attention to, rather than just dismissing ruin porn, you know, as just maybe the way in which privileged people take pleasure in looking at a dilapidated neighborhood, for example. That's the usual meaning of ruin porn. Ruin porn tells us, as a topic heading, that there's something erotic in the spectacle of collapse, that potentially demolition and collapse has a sexuality. Otherwise, why would it draw us in? So let's actually have a look at some ruin porn. This is a very high culture ruin porn. And the clip that I'm going to start with is one that, you know, as I develop the talk and as I show you images, this will, for anyone who's ever seen Geoffrey Reggio's film, queerness, this film will anyway be playing in the background in your unconscious. So we may as well look at it and then we'll talk about it for a minute. So here's the next, here's what we're going to work towards. This is the if you like, the money shot of ruin porn. And if you don't know what it is, I'll tell you what it is in a moment. And this is the clip. And this is from Kayana Scotzi, and we don't have super loud vocabulary. And our able techie is going to start it at the proper moment, so we don't have to watch it for 10 minutes. Now it's not moving. There we go. That. You get the point. You get the point that on the one hand, the film gives us these beautiful grids, cities built in these grid-like formats. That happened with St. Louis, it happened with New York City. On the other hand, the film is telling us the grid hasn't worked, the world is out of balance, something's gone wrong, and this is the climactic moment in which the buildings collapse. And the fact that we're given one shot after the other within this genre that I'm calling ruin porn suggests that the collapse is sort of the aftermath of this masculinist fantasy that's oriented around erection, right? And that's how architecture works in many ways. It is a masculinist project. Most architects at that time were and remain men. And there's a fantasy of sort of dominating the landscape, building things that are larger and higher and more phallic, right? You've seen a million of these phallic buildings. So now you can see that actually paying some attention to collapse might give us insights also into masculinity, and a different kind of masculinity, one oriented, in fact, towards detumescence, the aftermath of these erections that are unsustainable, that embody high cultural masculinist fantasies of dominating the landscape, but are terrible for the people who live there. Why? Why don't they work? Well, they didn't work because you actually can't fix social problems with architecture. I mean, that's just an obvious point, but one we'll return to. What happened in St. Louis in particular was that after these buildings were built and poor people were moved into them. There was one section that was for white people, one section that was for black people. Once the white people realized they were living in proximity to black people within a very segregated landscape, the white people began to move out. The white people typically had better paying jobs than the black people in the other buildings. And when they moved out, the maintenance fees disappeared. The money to maintain the buildings was not there. White flight out of St. Louis was ongoing. The suburbs were being built. The city was being evacuated, and there were no jobs available. So you have the modern architecture. You've moved people out of the slums. You've put people in the gorgeous buildings, but there's no jobs. There remains deep and entrenched segregation and racism within the city. White flight, no employment, and the police are, instead of securing the buildings, are policing the buildings because it is now a black housing culture. So given all of that, Pruitt ego could not last, and that's true for all of these buildings. So these images are usually used, as they are in Koyaanisqatsi and in the films and the literature on Pruitt ego, to signal the end of modern architecture. This is when you get all of these pronouncements about the end of culture, the end of modernism, the end of, this and that. But it is the end of what we could call these grand schemes to improve human life with a one-stop fix. There are also, however, images that we should investigate for information about the abandonment of poor people, the movement away from public funding for low-income housing. And the ruins themselves are monuments to past and potential future dreams of living outside of the grid, of the carceral state and the governmental order of things. So here's the Le Corbusier. A house is a machine for living. And if anyone's visited any of Le Corbusier's buildings, like the one outside of Marseille, there's also, there are a couple of other of these buildings. They are beautiful and they are lovely and they are seductive. But outside of France, these buildings did not come with the social support necessary for such buildings to flourish. Even left-wing thinkers and dreamers believed that the way out of the blight, the urban blight of the 60s and 70s, was to build up. And I've recently been doing a little bit of research on this project called Skyrise for Harlem that was imagined by Black poet June Jordan in collaboration with the crazy eclectic architect Buckminster Fuller. And they imagined that they could rebuild Harlem by creating what they called trees for living. And the idea was that you put people up in the sky and you create access to fresh air and so on. By the way, this project was never built. No one would fund it after the 1970s, and it was seen as what we're going to call a future ruin. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. Now, I did have some images. I think the one at the top there is the Gorbals. Those were the Queen Elizabeth Square buildings here in Glasgow, had the exact same narrative as Pruitt ego. Went up, I think, in the 60s. Does anyone know? I think it was in the 60s, yeah. Went up in the 60s, promised poor people beautiful architecture. It was this sort of brutalist structure. People moved in, were delighted with their new accommodations, and then realized they couldn't live there. It was unlivable. The architecture was all wrong. You couldn't hang laundry from the balcony. It was too windy. You couldn't be on the balcony. It was too cold. It was Glasgow, after all. And people moved in with high dreams and then quickly became completely disenchanted. The same fate met Queen Elizabeth Square as met Pruitt ego. And again, at an event that was filmed and repeatedly played on TV subsequently, the Gorbals were blown up. They were demolished in 1993 to an audience of thousands. So what is it then that draws us, on the one hand, to the fantasy of architectural fix? On the other hand, why are we so fascinated when the buildings come down? And then finally, is there something queer in all of this that we can identify as a kind of erotics of collapse? And that's what we're going to try to look at next. All right, let's see where we go here. Well, there's the image. And of course, it is quite beautiful to watch the collapse, but I want you to think about why it is. There is something about the way in which the collapse is vertical, right? Things don't sort of explode and blow in many different directions. What's up is suddenly down, right? It is literally this arc of detumescence that we're watching. And it's somehow gets this, the visual juices going. And we're going to have to ask why. This is one of the photographs by a guy whose work I'm going to look at in much more detail in a moment. This is Alvin Baltrop's photograph. Baltrop, as I said, was a black gay man who went, like many people did, to the west side of New York City in the aftermath of post-industrial collapse in the 1970s. There were all these piers on the west side of New York, and they themselves had fallen into ruin. The shipping industry left New York. The big ocean liners were replaced by airplane travel. And the city was too bankrupt to do anything with these buildings. So it left them standing. So what happened to these buildings? Gay men came here to cruise. Drug dealers came here to deal drugs. Homeless people came here to live. And what happened was a whole society of the dispossessed emerged in the ruins of this industrial culture. And Baltrop decided, I'm going to take pictures of this culture that's thriving in this falling down place. And it was very dangerous to go into the piers, but hundreds of gay men went there and cruised and made art. You could find spray-painted graffiti by Keith Haring in the piers. You could find paintings by David Wojnarowicz in the piers. Paintings that nowadays would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that were eventually pulled down when the piers were finally declared completely unsafe. So before something has been rebuilt, it sort of shimmers with possibility. And that possibility is glimpsed by the very people who the city has marginalized. Gay men in particular were policed at that time, and the bars were being raided. You know of that because of Stonewall. Stonewall makes a big deal about gay liberation being something that takes place in the bars when the police raids happened and people protested. Well, lots of people didn't go to the bars for that exact reason. And we could plot a completely different chart of gay liberation if we began in the piers instead of the bars. Why? Because these were unregulated spaces. The police did not dare go there. The West Side Highway had collapsed and it was impossible to access by car. So if you wanted to go there, you had to work very, very hard to get there. And once there, you were probably going to stay into the night. You might be robbed. You could be knifed. Any number of things could happen. But it also sort of bristled with the frisson of these illegal and unregulated engagements, a large part of which were the activities of gay men cruising. Now, Baltrop, this is what interests me about Baltrop. There he was, a gay man who'd been taking pictures of, he was in the Navy, and he took pictures of his Navy bunkmates in very gay ways that they didn't probably know about, mostly when they were semi-naked. So he had already got a career of taking pictures of half-naked men, and then suddenly he's in the piers. And what happens is his photography becomes obsessed with the collapsed architecture itself. So very often in his photographs, and you'll see this when we get to his work in more detail in a moment, there is a little spectacle of two men engaged in a sex act somewhere in the frame. And there probably is one in this frame. They're usually in the dead center. But he used a regular camera because he couldn't take an expensive camera to the piers. He would have gotten robbed. And he was often at a long distance from the men he was photographing. So their images were like this. But the image of the collapsed architecture was huge and framed all of these erotic encounters. Now, my argument is where you have a photograph where the architecture is massive and the human presence is small, why are you not reading the architecture? Why do we obsessively only look for the human presence? And furthermore, why don't we look for an erotics that is sort of distributed across the frame as opposed to just captured by a human sex act? There are many different kinds of erotics that vibrate in the culture around us and that are not just proper to sex acts. This is why some people find a space sexy and another space is not, right? There's regulations around where you can have sex, where you may not have sex. Those modern architectures, like Pruitt Ego, presumed heterosexual families in which the space would be divided up such that there was a bedroom proper for heterosexual reproductive sex, and then the rooms of the children that were surveyed by the parents. Queer architecture proposes that there's an erotics to exploding precisely that model of living and looking outside of those concrete boxes for other ways of bodies to be in relation. And that plays out in the work that I'm going to show you. This is where are we here? This is the Bronx in the 1970s. So just so you can see that what was happening in the piers was not unique. All of New York looked like this. This is the Bronx, where landlords were burning down buildings in order to move poor people out and collect insurance on them. This is what the Bronx looked like. East Tremont was completely collapsed and demolished to make way for expressways and so on. What we can say about the 70s is that global cities, in many ways, were demolition sites. And in those demolition sites, urban planners saw blight and they saw ruins that had to be removed. And that's why people went off to the suburbs. So straight white people go off to the suburbs, and these demolition sites of cities are left for everyone else. And in those ruins, people made life. So we don't want to rush over this chapter in urban planning to get to what comes next. We want to pause and say that in this pause is where queer culture happened. And by the time you get gentrification, gay men in particular have already been uploaded into the economy as gentrifiers. They've bought up a lot of the property. They're no longer the people cruising in the ruins. They are the developers. They are the people arguing against a homeless shelter because it will bring down the property values in the West Village. And there's a complete transformation in the way in which gay men in particular are situated in relationship to the economy. So if we stay with these images for a minute, we catch a glimpse of queer culture otherwise. And it's a queer culture that is opposed to rebuilding and wants to stay with the ruin for a moment. And tomorrow night, when I speak at the university, I'm going to tell about the work of a Black sculptor called Beverly Buchanan, who at the same moment in the 70s went around the city picking up pieces from demolition sites that became the basis for her entire art practice. So there are, queer people going to demolition sites, creating sculptures from the ruins, gay men cruising in the ruins. There are entire communities gathering in these, derelict buildings, people making art in them, and so on. So we should not turn away from the building once it's collapsed. That's ruin porn, where you're only interested in how it comes down. You're not interested in what happens next. That's where we'll stay. And this is the work of Gordon Matta Clark. And this gives you a sense of what Gordon Matta Clark was doing. This is a building in Paris. I think it was in about 1975, when the city was pulling down buildings left and right in Paris to make way for the Centre Pompidou. okay? And this was a 17th century townhouse, beautiful, beautiful building that the city said, this has to come down. And so Matt Clark got permission to cut this spiral shape into the building that had been slated for demolition. And through the spiral, he made it so that at the very heart of the spiral, you could go in and you would see through the spiral the site of where the Centre Pompidou was being built. So he wanted to like force you to see the gentrifying future through the present of the ruined building and draw attention to the beauty of the architecture that was being torn down. Now, I imagine in Glasgow, this resonates a little bit. I went to the show on dereliction that's just down the road that is interested in all these different buildings in Glasgow that are derelict and that have just been left and abandoned on behalf of gentrifying interests that have no use for them. Matt Clark was trying to make something beautiful out of buildings that the city said were of no importance whatsoever. Just so you know, the term collapse, and I'm not sure if we go there yet. So this is the vocabulary for an aesthetics of collapse: cutting, dismantling, undoing, unmaking, dereliction, dispossession, destruction, demolition again. This is a different aesthetic vocabulary than the one used by architecture, and it's a different aesthetic vocabulary than the one used by painting, but it has within it all kinds of political possibility. Okay, so let's think about the term collapse itself. If you look at the definition for collapse, it doesn't just mean something falls. It's from the Latin col, meaning together, and then labi, meaning slip. So there's already a kind of collectivity, col, together, built into the word collapse. So it's not when something collapses, it's when many things collapse at once. And it's that notion of collectivity that I'm hoping to sort of unlock here. All right. So here's another piece. This is the one by Gordon Matt Clark that I think has a very queer resonance. Matt Clark wasn't necessarily queer. He was married. But there he was in the piers alongside all of the gay men doing his work. He was in a queer community at the time. This is the house that I think is the critique of a heterosexual architecture. It's called Splitting. And what he did was he took a house that had been foreclosed on in the suburbs. He went out, he took a sawzall or a sort of chainsaw, and he cut it down the middle, okay? Now, it's interesting that if you want to split a house without it completely falling down, that takes a lot of architectural know-how. It's not simple to split a house open. And if you want to know what the aesthetic gesture is, it's the bit of light in the middle of the photograph, that V shape. That's the aesthetic. That if you were looking like, where's the art? That's it. Because what he was able to do is he figured out that the house had to fall back on its own foundation. And as it falls back, it splays open. And in that way, he was sort of critiquing the way in which all of architecture is designed on behalf of the heterosexual family, okay? What is architecture? A machine for living. Who's living there? The family, okay? So now you can see why a queer emphasis would be on destruction, demolition, collapse. We don't want these little boxes that people live in. They force a certain kind of structure, a sexuality, a social product upon you, and make it so that it becomes impossible, for example, to imagine living with friends. Where's the architecture for living with friends, right? Apart from some TV show that gives you 7 people with impossibly expensive apartments, right? That's not it. Where's the architecture for elaborate extended families? Where's the architecture for newly arrived immigrants who need share space? What's that architecture? Well, why don't we have it? That's what, I know it seems like, how can that building say that? But it literally is cutting down the middle a house that is understood as a whole in its integrity and is unexamined for all of the assumptions that are embedded in the architecture of kitchen, dining room, living room, master bedroom, which we don't use that word anymore apparently, primary bedroom, and 2 little bedrooms, even down to how many kids you're supposed to have is embedded in that architecture. So to cut it down the middle is already to be doing violence to the project that modern architecture is selling you in a queer way. The other person who did that was Rachel Whiteread in the piece that got her the, is it the Turner Prize? I never can remember, yeah. It's just called House, 1993, also built in a low-income area of London, slated for demolition. She took a house, as did Gordon Matta Clark, slated for demolition. And she made a plaster cast of the home's interior. Why would you do that? To show you, and this is interesting in relationship to a real estate market, that most of what we call a house is nothing. It's just air. Like, that's the interior of a house. It's a block. It's a massive block. Like, think about what you're living in when you're in this room we're in. Yes, there's walls and a ceiling, but what is it? What is it framing? Space, empty space. And like Gordon Matta Clark, Rachel Whiteread, in a way, was calling attention to speculative capitalism that saw no need any longer for low-income housing, precisely because they wanted to sell you nothing for a massive amount of money. So this and architecture stuff is really interesting in terms of a critique of real estate capital. And Rachel Whiteread, right, was completely criticized for this piece, even though I think it's a beautiful monument, both it's both a monument to low-income housing and the social project that would sustain it, but also to the way in which so many of these cookie-cutter houses become domestic prisons for women. And that monument did not remain. I think it was there for a minute and then quickly gone. All right, so for the second part of the talk, I've tried to give, it's not a very exhaustive history of that period, but it's a reminder that in the 60s and 70s, everyone thought you should build up. By the late 70s into the 90s, everyone thought everything should come down. So we have this masculinist up, down, and we're looking for the pause, the queerness, the possibilities that lie in between the cycles of boom-bust architecture. So a ruins in reverse. Cinema has always been interested in ruins, but cinema can do something that real life cannot. It can reverse the order of things. So this is a film. Will it just play or do I click again? Yeah. This is a very, very famous film, and I'll just talk over it for the sake of time, by the Lumiere brothers, pioneers of cinema, who in 1896, interestingly enough, one of the first films ever made is called Demolition of a Wall, 1896. So if we're at all confused about whether there's an aesthetics to demolition, here it is, right? Before Pruitt Ego, before bringing down the bubbles, there is Demolition of a Wall by the Lumiere brothers, in which one of the brothers is supervising the demolition of a building. And that should have been it. It was just a sort of interesting experiment in filmmaking at the Lumiere studios. But did you see that? When somebody was running the film, they made a mistake and sent it into reverse. And we're now watching the reverse of the first part. And, oh wow, everything is built back together again. And what came down goes back up. The smoke disappears. Miraculously, the wall stands. And when the Lumiere brothers realized that the projector had mistakenly put the wrong reel on in the wrong order, they loved it. And they're like, oh, let's always play this film in this way. Okay, so all I want to say about that is the fantasy of, the mania for demolition. The fantasy is what goes down can come back up. And we want to sort of press pause on that fantasy. I want to remind you that only in cinema does what goes down come back up. And we want to think instead with that first half of the film and stay with the demolition and be less preoccupied with the repair and the rebuilding. And in many ways, this is an anti-reparative project. I'm saying you can't put things back together again. Just pulling the building down does not get rid of the problem. And in fact, repair may be the problem. It's certainly the problem in cinema. Because of that little clip, I believe, we have a million narrative plot structures that show you something being taken down, and then miraculously, in the second half of the film, show you everything being put back together again. That is literally the plot of every romantic comedy you've ever seen. Okay, so what if repair was not the answer, but was actually the problem? What if we need to step back from repair and live with collapse and architecture and look there for some tips on how to unmake the world, right? When Stephen introduced me, he said, I bet all of us agree that this is a pretty shit world that we're living in. These are not good times. This is not a moment when we can applaud the way in which things have been put together. If that's the case, then art and intellectual endeavor should be trying to figure out how the hell we take everything apart and begin again, or something, who knows what. Finally, for Matt Clark then, this was the piece that brought him into the same realm as all the gay men who are cruising. This is a piece called Day's End, and it was done right at the end of his life. He only made work for about 6 years. He died at the age of 35 of cancer, and left this massive archive that his wife still manages and keeps. But what he did in 1975 was he kept going to those piers, the very piers that Alvin Baltrop was photographing. And he made this massive cut into the side of the warehouse. And that might look to you like, what's that? Big deal. But when you go in the warehouse into that particular pier, he also made a cut into the floor. And so what that means is that when the sun shone, it would come in there, and it's the west side, so it was at the end of the day. The sun would come in through there, strike the water on where he had cut another hole into the base of the warehouse, and it would have a kind of cathedral effect. And the light would scatter around this dark and dingy space. And so again, just as it was the V-shaped space that was the art gesture, the aesthetic gesture in the other piece, the gesture here is that moment when the light hits the water. And interestingly enough, Samuel Delany, a chronicler of queer life at that time, and also a science fiction writer, a black gay man who grew up in New York City around that time, his autobiography is called The Motion of Light on Water, and much of his time was spent in the piers cruising. So there, that's also queer art, right? How light does or does not enter a space, how something that is seen as abhorrent and dangerous by everybody else becomes a kind of temple or shrine for queer people who go there. But the person taking the picture, notice, is Alvin Baltrop. So he is the one with whom I want to now start to develop this language of collapse, an aesthetic language of collapse. Here's one of his photographs. And again, during his lifetime, nobody was interested in Alvin Baltrop's photographs. He took them around to gallery after gallery, and people were just like, yeah, no, pass, not interested. Towards the end of his life, he died of cancer, I think in the 90s, the great queer art critic Douglas Crimp got interested in his work and put together a show for him. And that was the only time that he had any recognition for his work at all. Since his death, these works, these photographs have become completely iconic. There was a show 2 years ago at the Bronx Museum in New York City of the photographs, and they are now understood to capture a lost world of, pre-AIDS, gay male cruising and sex, and that they are. But there's more to the photographs. And because it's been gay male critics who have mostly returned to the work, the emphasis is on the fact that there are all of these scenes of naked men hanging out. How can they just be sitting naked in the middle of the day in the middle of a major city? Because no one else went there. No one else went there. It was considered too dangerous. So this is how we see that these dispossessed landscapes become central to queer life in the 1970s. But what about that building in the background? And there's almost no commentary in the analysis of Baltrop of these incredible shapes that the buildings are making as they begin to fall down. And that's what I would call an erotics of collapse. That particular shape that the building makes in the collaboration between gravity, entropy, and the whatever structure had held the building in place. The brokenness of the facade, the fact that there's this, what one architectural critic calls a queer crumple in the middle of the building, that Frank Gehry, you know, you'd have to pay him millions to put a little crumple like that into a building now. But there it is as part of the way in which time is literally sculpting the building. And I think we have to read the cruising against the collapsing structures, not separate altogether from it. So there's a few things to point out then about the images, and this was the one book that was ever published of his work. There you can see it. Look for the little white butt, really, at the very heart of the photograph. That's almost all you ever see of gay sex in a Baltrop photograph. He's too far away to get you pornographically close. And so what you end up with is really a kind of queer landscape, is how I would put it. It's a landscape in which the human is very small and inconsequential. And everything else, entropy, decline, collapse, the landscape of a city in disorder, is very large. And what we could say is that the erotic energy of the place doesn't simply depend upon the men. It also depends upon this setting. Now, if I gave you a painting of a beautiful sunset over an ocean and two men walking, you'd be like, oh, that's beautiful, isn't it? That's gorgeous. That's so sexy. Well, why? Why is the sunset sexy, but the falling down building isn't, right? How have we been drawn only to eroticize the erect building over the collapsed building? What other masculinities lurk in the collapse? What other relationships to even the phallic body are embedded in these falling down structures, right? Nothing stays up forever, okay? However much Viagra might want it to. There are Viagra types of architecture and art. And then these that point to even potentially a different relation to capital, one that is not invested in the shiny, the new, the functional, the efficient, but is deeply, erotically invested in the collapse and all of the debris that accompanies it. And that's what his camera seeks out. There's another perspective on that crumple, the way in which the building is literally, erotically sort of collapsing into the water. But there are also these images where, okay, finally, a close-up of a male body, lovely, in a jockstrap even, bonus, right? But he's completely framed by the debris on the floor, this window that is no longer a window. In a way, the male body is always competing with these other features of the landscape that his camera is completely drawn to. There it is again. Now the body is not even fully in the picture. It's just half a torso. The butt, which means it could be a man, it could be a woman. It's not even the phallus. These are undifferentiated bodies that are literally cut, dissected by the architecture. The eros here is the way in which the architecture and the body are sort of fused, in fact. There are some where we don't actually even know if the body is alive or dead. The body has just become like part of the material on the floor of the warehouse. The body means as much there as the umbrella that is open but useless, who needs an umbrella inside, right? So there are all these signs of, in a way, the unnaturalness of the space that are part of the gay landscape. All right, and there's more where, you know, these angles that make it seem as if the pier is trying to throw the bodies into the water almost, and so on. Finally, a money shot. Now you finally see there's a blowjob happening in the center there, but you can only access it through these girders that are coming down around it. And this does seem to me like a kind of romantic image, in fact, that you have this kind of urgency of desire that despite the precariousness of the landscape, the sex goes on. And yet, precisely because there's a kind of porno visual emphasis in a lot of gay male photography, where you can't see the sex act clearly, the photograph is sort of considered a dud. So I think we want to read against the explicit representation of the sex act and think about how sex is dispersed across this building in a state of collapse. Okay. And why would we do that? Here's another one. There's the gay men at the very center and so on. What's the alternative? That is the alternative, my friends. Jeff Koons with his horribly pneumatic, upright, erect puppies. What is that but a phallus, right? A Viagra phallus that has to stand outside of every museum in Europe announcing its perky readiness for capital, right? And of course we know that there's a phallic intensification in capital and that capital loves this sort of phallic order of things. There's the proof of it. There's nothing particularly appealing about this as compared to the other images, and yet this is millions of dollars, and Alvin Baltrop never sold a photograph in his life. Do you see? And I'm not saying that you couldn't have an image of a ruin that did sell $1 million. That was why I started with queerness. Only to say that this version of masculinity underwrites a massive amount of what we call the aesthetic, okay? And makes it impossible for us to see beauty in other places. All right. All right. So let me just end this section and then try to make a conclusion by turning to Shuggie Bain in Glasgow. And when I read this book, I loved it so much. And I loved it precisely for the way in which it wove the story of a Scottish queer childhood through the ruins of Glasgow in the 1970s. And you'll remember in the story, his mother is moved by the unscrupulous father from a place of, you know, moderate comfort where she lives near her parents to an outlying building, housing estate where there's nothing there. It's one of these soulless estates where there's no life for her to be had. And many people would just sort of see the queerness of this narrative as being in Shuggie Bain's relationship, Shuggie's relationship with his mother, his inability to fit in, and so on. But a lot of the queerness depends upon these gorgeous descriptions of the landscape. And the landscape is, as you'll see in this passage, is in fact the landscape of dereliction, collapse, and ruination. Kind of be better if someone else would read this, because obviously I do not have the requisite accent. Does anyone want to, I feel like I'm in my classroom now. Would anyone like to volunteer to read it? If not, I'm going to make Stephen read it. But is there anyone who wants to read it? Yes, thank you. Lovely.
I suppose as Shuggie. Shug. Either Shug or Shuggie. Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart. They strutted like two cowboys across the flat, upturned earth. On the face of the mine sat the main colliery building. As big as Glasgow Cathedral, the abandoned building sat like a lonely giant on the moon. Large broken windows were set in simple arches, too high for a view, but high enough to catch all the day's light for the cavernous inside. The windows that remained intact were blacked out with coal dust. At the far end of the building, a large smokestack towered into the sky, and in wet days you could barely see the top for the soaking clouds. Pipes and rods lay scattered on the ground. The hurried tearing of hacksaws visible in the ends, looters taking what they could strip before the mine was officially dismantled for scrap.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Beautiful. All right, so here I would say that this scene of a derelict mine, and this is where Shuggie and his brother Leek, they are there trying to scavenge from this former mining site. But it becomes an opportunity for Leek to try to teach his effeminate young brother some lessons in virility. So I guess what I want to say is that the scene of the derelict mine isn't just color commentary. You know, it's not just there to tell you where they are. It's doing valuable work in outlining the shape, the nature of Shuggie's queerness itself. It's also making connections rather than distinctions between the masculinities shared by all the men in the novel, including Shug the elder, Leek the brother, and Shuggie the little queer boy. They're all part of a collapsed masculinity. The father is not powerful. He, in fact, is himself ruined, and Leek never does really make it. They all share in a kind of dereliction of masculinity in the wake of post-industrial decline, right? So the very thing that lent masculinity its authenticity, work, is not there anymore. The mine is gone. And in the aftermath of the mine, what is a man is the question. And it's a question that is, you know, bullied out of Shuggie, but plays across all the men in the book. And so there's an amazing little scene between Leek and Shug. Oh, here it is. Between Leek and Shuggie, where Leek tries to get Shuggie to abandon his effeminate ways. And so here they are about to go into this mine, and Leek says, Shuggie has said something about a certain person being common and being worried about this being very common. And Leek says, we boys shouldn't talk like old women. So that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, try not to be so swishy when you walk. And then lesson number 3, at his attitude, it's time you tried to blend in more. So here we are. And for me, this is a really central, deeply important moment in the landscape. The rest of, you know, a lot of the book after that is about Shuggie's relationship with Agnes Bain. And the beauty of that relationship, if you think about it, is that Agnes cannot be saved by Shuggie. She is broken. She's broken by patriarchy. She's broken by abandonment. She's broken by the housing development. And all she has is the son who will never reproduce, her no future, if you like. And what Shuggie does that is in the mode of caretaking is decides not to repair her, but to live with her in her brokenness. And that too is part of what it means to be queer, is to recognize a kind of brokenness that does not seek repair, unlike Shug the father, who is constantly trying to repair things in the same way that the city does by pulling down the buildings. Shug just takes Agnes and places her outside of his orbit and says, if I can't have you, no one can have you. You will be abandoned out here. Shuggie, the gay boy, decides that he will accompany Agnes through her alcoholism to the point of her death. And it's that holding back from repair, I would say, not the swishiness, not saying common, not the attitude that marks him as queer. All right. I can't tell whether you're agreeing with me. That's all right. We're going to conclude then. And I'm going to try to do the first part of this last section quickly, because I'm sure, you know, I've gone on long enough and we want to get to some discussion. But for this last part, I'm going to get to the work of Joan Eardley, who made the most gorgeous landscapes, but also made paintings of children in Glasgow. But before that, we have to sort of establish, in the same way that I've tried to establish that collapse might be queer, Is it possible that a landscape itself could be queer? And the only way I can kind of, well, there's some of the paintings by Joan Eardley that I'm interested in. You know, if you see a painting like that, one of her Catalan paintings, people will be like, yeah, it's beautiful, but it's got nothing to do with queerness. Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, if you were looking at a Turner seascape, you wouldn't say it had nothing to do with him being a white man, especially when there's a slave ship somewhere in the painting. No painting cannot be about the person who paints it. So we need an expanded vocabulary for thinking about what constitutes queer aesthetics. And that's what I'm after here, looking at the background rather than just the foreground, looking at the abstraction rather than the figure, looking at the broken rather than the scene of repair. Because that way we're in the place of the critique of the normative and the heteronormative, but we're also thinking about these strategies that elude the obvious and the conventional. The way that we're going to get there, and this is elaborate, but I'm going to actually just do it in a few moves, is by returning to an essay by Robert Smithson. And Robert Smithson's essay sort of underpins this entire project, if you like. Smithson famously, I think it was in 1966, wrote, and he was a big land artist in the US. His famous work was Spiral Jetty, and he made land art at a time when people didn't think you could make art on a landscape. How could you do that? That's not art. Art is on a piece of canvas or is a rock that you've sculpted. No, he built his art into the landscape. He wrote this very famous essay that exactly shows us what a heterosexual landscape is. And by implication, then, we can get to what a queer landscape might be. So he went off on a little day outing to Passaic, New Jersey. And remember back to Pruitt-Ego, the reason the Pruitt-Ego buildings failed was because of white flight to the suburbs. So at that very moment, the suburbs are being built. And off he goes on an outing into the suburbs. He calls this essay something like The Minor Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, and finds himself in a kind of hellscape, what he calls a ruins in reverse, a future ruin. He can see that something ruinous is already being built, something monstrous is emerging from this construction site. And he describes this landscape filled with machinery to build the suburbs that is otherwise flat and without feature. He calls it a zero panorama, a ruins in reverse. Describes it as full of holes, or what he calls monumental vacancies. And he's saying, you know, that in this horrendous landscape, you can already see the shape of a future that is going to be, you know, unappealing, the end of something, and so on. But then suddenly he stumbles across, this is bottom left, these pipes pumping liquid into the river. And he writes, "The great pipe was in some enigmatic way connected with the infernal fountain. It was as though the pipe was secretly sodomizing some hidden technological orifice and causing a monstrous sexual organ, the fountain, to have an orgasm." And then he concludes, "A psychoanalyst may say that the landscape displayed homosexual tendencies. I will not draw such a crass anthropomorphic conclusion. I will merely say it was there." Okay. What? What just happened, right? So here we are in a landscape where a bunch of cookie cutter houses are about to be built. It is monumental for its nothingness. It is full of holes. It is zero panorama. It is vacant. And then suddenly there's this big gushing genital in the middle of the whole thing. And he says, here it is. This mess is the homosexual. Something's being sodomized under the ground, right? So he can read sexuality onto this landscape, heterosexuality into the vacancy, the zero panorama, and homosexuality into the something that bursts from the fundaments and seeks to destroy this zero panorama. And this is, to me, a way of sort of going back to the Alvin Baltrop and saying that which seems distinct from sexuality cannot be, always should be read through the lens of the erotic, and it will turn out that not everything we see is already inscribed into a heterosexual vocabulary. Gordon Matta Clark, for example, right before he died, he wrote in a letter, "What I do to buildings is what some do with language and others with groups of people. I organize them in order to explain and defend the need for change." So I'm saying we should be reading landscape and buildings the same way we read language, the same way we read Shuggie Bain, the same way we read a novel and we find the queer plot somewhere lurking in the picture of Dorian Gray that has to be put in a closet, right? We can read into these things, and when we do, it'll be interesting to see the queer features that we find. So if we grant that there is such a thing as a straight landscape and a homosexual landscape, and these are the signs of it, of the heterosexual landscape, and then this fundament bursting forth, the sodomitical pipes, the homosexual landscape. Let's just try and use this to move finally to Joan Eardley. So I'm making the argument that there is language, there is languaging in landscapes and in buildings. And here we are in some of Joan Eardley's early paintings that were done in her studio near Townhead. And I hope this isn't going to be completely controversial, but I'm going to say that her paintings of children are super unremarkable and conventional. And there's a kind of just geometrical, what would you call it, obligation in a woman painting children. Even though I know she had relationships with the children in Townhead. Her studio was there. She spent time with the families. I know all of that. But the paintings of the children, I mean, if you compare it to Alice Neal or somebody else painting around that time, the actual figures are almost kitsch a little bit, a bit cartoonish, but that doesn't, for me, doesn't necessarily detract from the painting. She suggested in her own writings a way to read these paintings, and she said, "I like the friendliness of the back streets. Life is at its most uninhibited here." And then she said, "Dilapidation is often more interesting to a painter, as is anything that has been used and lived with." Now, you could have put in there, dilapidation is more interesting to a queer painter, which she was, right? Not only a queer painter, but a butch, a masculine woman living in a moment when it was extremely difficult to articulate who she was and her place in the art world and so on. But the fact that she's drawn to dilapidation and that languaging in the background of the graffiti competes, if you like, with the sentimentality of the children, suggests that we can see these children as a sort of alibi for the painting, but the painting is something else. She explained that she saw the children she painted as bits of red and bits of color. That's an interesting way to describe kids. Bits of red, bits of color. They're painterly for her. They are part of the arrangement. They are not themselves necessarily individuated or sentimentalized or something that she wants to be in relationship to. She then says finally, they are Glasgow. They are Glasgow. So there's the real, that's, if you like, the landscape. I say that these are landscape paintings. These are not paintings of figures. And the figures are to be read as bits of color, bits of red, bits of color, against which we begin to see this crumbling backdrop of the tenements of Townhead. I like the friendliness of the back streets. Life is at its most uninhibited. Uninhibited is an interesting word too. Dilapidation is more interesting to the painter. And there's another one. And you see, the kids are all the same, actually. They're not distinct. They're bits of color. Whereas the graffiti on the back wall is extraordinary and super interesting to me anyway, in terms of a kind of inscription that people are making on the walls around them. And I think we can read some of that coloring against some of the landscapes that come later. And I'm saying here, what if you read them in the same way as this, where the subject is not really the gay men, the little figures of the gay men, but is everything around it. Start reading the background for the queer material the same way you would in a novel. You read the backstory to try to figure out what the queer plot really is. All right, and so that then takes us to Cataline. These are the works that she's best known for, where now the body is completely absent, and we get the full expression, I think, of this queer landscape. It's hard to read a landscape as queer. One way to think about it is that she abstracts the landscape, and a lot of people have both criticized her for not completely turning to abstraction, and others have said that they're too abstract, even as they try to pick out certain features of the Cataline shore. But I think she apparently would ask people to let her know locally if a storm was coming, and she particularly painted in winter and would strap her canvas down and paint in the storm. And you could say the subject is turbulence itself, and is potentially the turbulence that she lived with, a kind of turbulence that is interested in nature, but not completely wedded to the idea of the natural, precisely because she herself is defined against it. So I leave it as a kind of open question for you as to whether we can do something with this argument about an aesthetics of collapse to return to a painter such as Joan Eardley and find these languages in her work that make the work readable within, a queer aesthetic. I have many more queer artists who, in a contemporary lens, do participate in an aesthetics of collapse. This is Boychild, who often performs and has performed very regularly in Glasgow and performs kind of choreographies of collapse that are indebted to the Japanese dance system Buto. This is a great piece by a non-binary Black artist, Kian Williams, who scoured demolition sites in New York City where low-income housing had been pulled down and creates new sculptures out of the bits and pieces, the detritus out of low-income housing. And this is Eve Laris Cohen, who literally unbuilt a whole studio in homage to Gordon Matta Clark. So I'm going to end there just by saying, leaving you with a kind of question. How can we read these backdrops, landscapes, and architectural practices as queer? And then how can we connect them to critiques of real estate capital, critiques of modern architecture, and critiques of the way in which architecture serves over and over again the heteronormative project of building machines for living for some people only, and abandoning the much bigger, more imaginative project of thinking how architecture can help us to live otherwise. Thank you.
Hello. Jack, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for the lecture. I'd like to open it up to any questions anyone might have. Anyone?
I do want to ask something about, in particular, when you were talking about Joan Eardley and her landscapes. Yeah, they're broken down and it's almost ruinous landscapes.
Right.
But it was interesting when you said about the figures or the children, because I've never looked at them like that.
Yeah.
And instead I've kind of looked at them as ruinous as well. It's almost as if when she's painting them, you can see elements in the painting where there is detail. And it's interesting that then some of the artists connected to that, there's elements of ruinous bodies in ruinous spaces or connected with ruinous spaces. And I know you probably want to focus on the architecture and the landscape, but I'm wondering if you've thought about that and whether whether you could speak on a connection between that, just because it's something I saw throughout or was thinking about throughout.
Yeah, I really like that point. I like the idea that in the figure itself, there are these fissures and breaks, and that the child doesn't appear as a sort of coherent, solid figure, but is also fractured in the course of the painting. I think that's a really nice reading, actually. But it's also a way of sort of, again, distributing the child as paint, you know, as an excuse for paint across the landscape, and pushing back on our desire wherever we see a child to indulge in these sentimental narratives about how, oh, you know, the real tragedy of the slum is the child. You know, why is the real tragedy of the slum the child, as opposed to anyone else who's living there and not the mother, for example? And, you know, much is made in a lot of the biographical material about how close she was to the Sampson family. And I think that that's an attempt to inscribe her almost into a maternal position that I believe the paintings resist. And I mean, she's obviously like such an amazing painter. She could have painted the child in a more interesting, defined, individuated way. And the fact that she doesn't is what we should be reading. And that reading actually works for me. That the figure of the child is there, but it's also ruined. It's also fragmented. It's also sort of collapsing. That's really nice. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. You said that when we have to think about it, we think about taking apart. And I wondered if you would extend that and say that we have a kind of responsibility to return to critique as a mode of thinking. You mentioned critique at the end, particularly critique as non-imperialist, non-patriarchal.
Yeah, wow, that's a good point, because there's such an emphasis nowadays, right, in academia. There's this Rita Felsky against critique, which I'm so tired of, you know, because the argument of against critique, for people who don't know it, is just like, oh, really, is that all we can do? We just critique things. Can't we do anything else? Well, first of all, you know, across the whole history of criticism, people have done a million different things. It's not as if even in a critique, that's all that's happening, right? But what you're saying is a reminder that the intellectual is a privileged person who is being given time to think, read, and write. And that time shouldn't just therefore be spent in the world that we live in. To spend the time just enumerating all the great things about the culture is to be a kind of handmaiden to capital. There is an obligation, in fact, to use a particular training to see what the problems are with the way in which entire populations are being trained to think. Yeah, and so I do think that in looking for cracks and collapse and in making an argument against repair, I think you could say this is an argument for critique, but not the fetishizing of critique that gets played out every day on social media, you know, not that version, which is just like, you said X and that thing really rubbed me the wrong way and I can't have that. You know, really good, impactful critique, obviously, is critique that is slow to build and requires us to think hard, because you're, you know, as Butler once said, when people were critiquing her work, and you know, there are many, many people from the Pope to your average professor in philosophy who critiqued Judith Butler, and she's like, you know, if I was saying something, of course my work's difficult. If I was saying something obvious, I wouldn't need to say it. And it's bothering you enough that there must be something in it, right? Why are you even spending your time critiquing me then, right? So the work that is most impactful in any given generation, it is work that rubs against the grain of what people are used to thinking, and does so in a way that might allow us to then think differently. And that's why I'm saying, like, you know, I began all of this work because I was asked to write an essay on architecture and gender. And I just bristled at that. I just thought, oh, what is there to say? And then that weekend I went to a show by Gordon Matta Clark in New York, and I was like, this is it. This is what I want to say. Forget architecture. How about an architecture? And I've really stayed with that because there's something about what Gordon Matta Clark was doing in unbuilding things that, as you're saying, feels like an intellectual project to me that is not dissimilar to queer theory, of a particular type. And I know I'm reaching for some of these readings, but then again, you know, Shuggie Bain doesn't make a lot of sense. If you pull all of these landscapes out, then it's just a coming out story and not a particularly remarkable one. What makes it remarkable is this attention to the slag heaps, the dirt, the rooming house that he begins in, the relations between people that are both enriched and impoverished by the landscapes in which they occur. And there are particular places where you can read the architecture in this way and other places where you cannot. And then I think finally, a lot of this is also sort of inspired by James Scott's work, Seeing Like a State. And that's the big book on this field, where he says, why did modernism think that the way to improve life was to regularize the city, build up in these grid-like structures, and then lock everyone in? Why did they think that? And the subtitle of the book is like, why modernism tried to come up with these big schemes to improve human life, and then why did they fail, right? So why did that become the project of modernism? Why did it fail, right? And then what is the legacy of those projects? The turning away, for example, from race and you know, a critique of white supremacy or patriarchy, and a desire for things to be fixed by the built environment. That's very appealing to people who don't necessarily want to upend anything, hence an architecture.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm new to your work, but I'm definitely going to check it out after this.
And you're what?
I'm new to your work.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to be cheeky and ask kind of like 2 questions in one, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah.
I guess I found it really interesting what you were saying about the looking for like the erotic nature in demolition and destruction. And I was wondering, I guess what stood out to me was like maybe some of the erotic in that is, as you say, the building of taller and taller buildings, and then in the tearing down either from like people or like for men, I suppose that's the opportunity to build even higher and taller in the future and see other people's work destroyed. And then I guess for people who aren't men, maybe some of the satisfaction and erotic in that is the destruction of these things that we don't agree with. So kind of, yeah, I was going to ask what you thought about that. And then second, with kind of the, with like an architecture, do you see in the future more organic and kind of very based on individual, like whatever that micro community or whoever is living together in a space, then kind of building from the very beginning very individual buildings if they have the resources? Or do you think that that's overly idealistic, I guess, and that like we need some of that structure? Or
Great. Lovely, great questions. I'll start with the second one. You know, okay, I've followed your argument this far, such as it is. What happens next? And, you know, there is a tendency to just say, well, yeah, you can't just be against repair because that makes it sound like we should just leave everything falling down. And it's like, well, no, it's not that we should leave everything falling down. It's that we shouldn't just consent to building under the aegis of real estate capital, which is what's happening now, right? Where everyone's paying ridiculous amounts of money for a house, or an entire generation is out of the opportunity of ever buying a house, right? How can we consent to that? That is the future of building, 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 right? So these pauses are kind of important in that way. But second, there are lots of architects who are imagining different ways of doing things. Many of them happen to be queer. No surprise if you're following along with this. For example, there's a young architect at MIT called Shuggie Bain, who has a kit that they've put together. They're a trans man architect, and they have a building kit. And that kit, you buy it for, in fact, you don't buy it, you just ask for it, and he sends it to you. And it's got enough pieces, it's like a sort of Lego kit or a construction kit. It could be a little small temporary house. You can put it together as a tent. You can put it together as a gym. It can be a storage shed. It can be a place you put your bike. It can, like, there's a million opportunities to build differently. And one of the things that Shuggie says is, when you build something, you should already know what its death would look like, right? Yeah, because modern architecture only built monumental buildings that would supposedly never fall down, which is why then you end up with the ruin porn, right? And contemporary real estate capital builds without even thinking about what ruinous things will happen if a building did fall down and all of this poisonous crap gets released, or you need to clear space for something and you have no idea how to take this thing apart. So Shuggie's point is, build things that you can take down. And second, everything should have multiple use. And third, we should all be making these kits for ourselves. And that's one example of this. It's impermanent, it's temporary, it's improvised. It can be any number of things. There's no copyright. You can grab that kit and build onto it, right? It's free, things like that. And yeah, it's a little bit more conceptual maybe than practical, but it has practical aspects to it. And then there's a guy, Andres Hacker, who's the dean of the School of Architecture actually at Columbia, and he does all kinds of architectural projects that are designed to critique places like IKEA. And he puts up counter IKEA warehouses and shows you how to move through the rooms. You know how in IKEA they have IKEA here, don't they? You move through the rooms and each one suggests to you yet another look. You know, it's just really the same as the last look, but with different cheap furniture that you'll never be able to put together. So he has a sort of un-IKEA project that really imagines how could we stage rooms in a completely different way. There's tons of this stuff. Like, I would almost call it, you know, it could be reverse architecture or queer architecture. And that work gets a lot less attention than the starchitecture stuff that takes up all of the money and all the headlines. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll hold on to the first one.
Thank you. My question is kind of, what's the space in this for the non-human? Because I would argue that all landscapes are inherently queer because they're this massive mishmash of overlapping and deeply intertwined, as physically intertwined bodies and not bodies. And also the buildings that are collapsing under the agency of plants, animals, fungus, and everything in between. So there's already a cross-species collaboration happening in that moment. And I'm just kind of wondering how that sort of plays out.
Well, that's my point about Baltrop, really. So thank you for sort of emphasizing that, is that when he captures those buildings coming down in the background, we're actually watching entropy and we're watching gravity. And as you say, we're watching all kinds of material processes that have nothing to do with the human and are not spurred on by human agency, and that are ongoing despite human presence rather than because of it. So in a way, pushing into the background of the painting or looking at the landscapes in Joan Eardley is to say that there's something queer about decentering the human on the one hand, and then bringing out these like multiple processes that are ongoing in the world around us. This is what Jane Bennett calls vibrant matter. The fact that there are all kinds of things happening both digitally, materially, vegetally around us, that the human's sensory capacity is so crude that we barely even are able to perceive. We can't see, for example, an orange peel on the ground is rotting. We can't see that it's rotting, but an animal, for example, would be able to know even what stage of decay the orange peel is in. we're only attuned to human life. And that's part of the problem, surely, that we are not properly attuned to all of the other systems that are at work around us. And so a landscape is literally painting what otherwise becomes just the backdrop for human activity and pulling it into the foreground, which doesn't mean that every landscape painting is queer, but it means that there's a possibility of reading a landscape with queerness in mind, and as you say, with a kind of sense of the collaboration with the non-human that is ongoing.
And I think, sorry, very briefly, I promise, there's something in all of the artworks that you've cited that they're very insistent on the materiality of either of the thing of the painting in Eardley's case, particularly in the landscape paintings, and in the photographs, insisting on the physical materiality of the thing that's being pictured. And I wonder if that's a sort of cross connection as well across these different modes.
Yeah, and also like at the end of his life, Gordon Matta Clark became obsessed with fungi. I mean, and I didn't even know this, you know, the archive that his wife still has, she lives in Connecticut with all of this stuff from his archive, because nothing remains of Matta Clark's work but photographs and documents. And he would zip himself into a kind of pod and hang himself from a tree and become a sort of pea pod. And then he would grow all kinds of fungal matter into the ground to see what it did to the material landscape, you know. So I'm thinking there are so many different ways of playing this once you pull the human out of the frame for a minute.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I just wanted to press you a little on your critique of the reparative.
Okay.
And so would you like to explain how you're using reparative in relation to Eve Sedgwick's queer reparation? Because it seems to me that you're not using it in the same way, but it would be interesting to hear how you tease out the differences, because I think that gesture of queer reparation is something that you possibly do underwrite.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, can you say how you understand Sedgwick's reparative?
I understand it as being accretive and not unmasking, and a form of critique that isn't paranoid, that isn't about unveiling and maintaining a kind of paranoid state which actually leaves us unable to respond politically, but that it's about supplementing. And in that sense, I would see the way in which you, the photographs you've shown and the actual erotic activity in the site of ruins as queer acts of accretion, if you like. They're about being present in and adding to in a way that is supplementing and not replicating.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I think.
Thank you. That's really eloquent. And of course, it is a difficult argument to summarize, and that's part of the problem, is that I think because of Sedgwick's essay on reparative reading, there's a way in which people have then felt that they have to decide between the paranoid and the reparative, and they don't. I mean, you're never going to be able to stop being paranoid, because the paranoid responds already to, in many ways, the truth of the culture that you live in. You know, it's like you can't be paranoid enough, in fact, and Sedgwick's very kind of clear about that. But the reparative is in a way, you're right, it's kind of what I'm arguing for in some sense, in the Sedgwickian sense, which is to change the form that the critique arrives in order to allow for the possibility of surprise. You know, because if people are never surprised, or if they are already seeing what's being telegraphed ahead, then you can't learn. You can only confirm, right? So there is a reparative reading here, and the reparative reading, and I think it's an unfortunate term, that's the problem, because when you come to architecture, you don't want the reparative. At least I don't want the reparative, because I want to make a strong argument for collapse, demolition, and disrepair, dereliction, dispossession, all of these things. And therefore, the reparative runs counter to that. And yet, the actual formal project here is reparative.
Yeah, I think that accretive is the key term, actually, when
Yes.
Sedgwick expands on what she thinks she means by reparative. And it's even there in the syntax that she uses.
That's right. And that, to me, then that's why it's so silly to have this Rita Felsky after critique stuff, because at that point, we've already been through several rounds of trying to push back on the theories that say, I'm going to argue that neoliberalism is bad. And then my conclusion is neoliberalism is bad. And I was right all along, right? So the paranoid is the way of saying, I'm going to prove something that we all know. And if I proved it, because it's so easy to prove, then I'll be right. When in fact, and this was a very Sedgwickian thing to do, what we need to run with is the counterintuitive, particularly when we're talking about the queer, because the queer is the counterintuitive within certain cultures of heteronormativity. It is counterintuitive to be queer when everyone's raised in a straight family. And therefore, the queer critique has to run along alternative lines to the heteronormative. And it runs out of steam when you only talk about queerness as gay or lesbian or even trans. And that's why you can hear in this project that there is also a kind of a desire to think through race, social marginalization, and class, because architecture has been particularly successful in managing problems around race and social marginalization, or imagining that it's managing them through architectural solutions. So the queerness here is to suggest that a really queer outcome is going to be good, not just for gay people, but for all the people who are marginalized by these kinds of fantasies of reparation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jack Halberstam.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being with us this evening. Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival does run until Sunday. We have 2 more talks here in the hub tomorrow evening. And then the Open Buildings programme starts from Friday through Sunday. So I encourage you to have a look at the website and come and join us. Thank you, everyone.